quick question before we start. Have you ever had a full day to get things done? No meetings, no interruptions, and somehow achieved less than you do on your busiest, most chaotic day? Yeah, then you're in the right place. You're listening to the Spacious Brain Podcast, where real neurodivergent humans with real jobs and real daily chaos overshare with pride. Minus the glossy, my ADHD is my superpower nonsense. Hi, I'm Noemi, a scientist, a neurodiversity coach. Yes, someone who will absolutely derail into a story from when I was 12 because I'm ADHD and tangents are my love language. If you ever felt alone or felt like the Temu version of neurodivergent because you're not an entrepreneur, not a CEO, and you forget to eat and drink on the same day, you're in the right place. Let's keep this real. In this episode, I'm joined by Beccy. Beccy works in people development and culture after making a bold career pivot from marketing. In this episode, we talk about what it means to discover ADHD later in adulthood, especially when you've spent years being seen as capable, high-performing, and reliable. We talk about burnout, self-doubt, impulsivity, and the strange mix of sadness and relief that comes when things start making sense. If you're a woman who spent years holding everything together on the outside while carrying chaos on the inside, this one is for you. Beccy, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
So I'll start with the usual question, which is, who is Beccy?
Who is Beccy? I could go really deep on this. So I am a 45-year-old woman. I live up in Scotland, and how do I describe my career? I currently work in people development and culture. That has been a big career pivot in my late 30s from previously working in marketing. And now I think my focus for me is to live a nicer life, to live a slightly calmer, slightly slower, slightly kinder life. I think that's how I'd describe myself.
That's lovely. And it's an amazing goal to have. I wish I could get there too.
It's easier to say than do. That's what I've learned.
And when were you diagnosed and what brought you to the diagnosis?
So I'm still on the waiting list for my official diagnosis. I eventually went to the doctor New Year's Eve 2024, and that was after about 2 years of conversations and questions with myself mainly about if this was a thing. So it was not something I'd ever considered until possibly about 4 years ago. I worked with someone who had been diagnosed in his mid-20s, and we got on so well in the workplace. I always say it was like working with my younger brother, and we worked really well together. We bounced off each other, but, we spent a lot of time together kind of outside of work and laughing and joking. And he used to make comments to me about having ADHD. And I used to always come with, yeah, I've got some traits that seem similar, but I don't think I have ADHD. And then he started sending me memes, and I was like, no, I do resonate. I've definitely got some of these traits, but I don't think I have it because I don't think it's ever stopped me. So I don't think I have ADHD. And then over time, you start questioning, thinking, actually, maybe this is something. And it got to the point. So this was August 2024. I finished working in my job. I still had some work to do. I had some studying to do. But to me, the stress of work was gone. I had 3 months. I was moving up to Scotland, but everything was kind of done. So it should have been like this really lovely end of the year. I had loads of time and loads of space. And what I noticed is without the structure and pressure of work, my mind just went into free fall. I couldn't focus on anything. I was jumping between one thing to the next. I got less studying done than I did when I was doing it around a full-time job. It was like something just happened and my mind was chaotic. My behavior was then chaotic. I was trying to pack my house up to move, so my house was chaotic. And there was just something in that moment that kind of made me realize that I think this is actually a thing. And then I started having conversations with other people who had already had a diagnosis or were aware they were self-diagnosed, let's say. And it was just starting to notice some of the similarities and not just the behavioral traits, but how that actually impacted them. And I just think over those few months, that's where it became quite apparent that I needed to go and get a diagnosis, because it was always, without that, it was always going to be this, well, I might have, but I don't know. And I think for me in that moment, it felt like it was really important and really powerful to kind of go and actually do something about it.
And how was that self discovery? Because, you said that you started with this friendship and with these jokes and then the memes. So it's basically it, and it's very common. It starts with external inputs, right? And things were like, no, no, I might have some of that, but no, no, definitely not. And then all of a sudden, like something clicks. So when that happened, how did that make you feel?
It was a bizarre point, because I think as soon as you think it is something, you then take on the judgment of other people. And then you realize just how sensitive you are to like judgment and rejection and things like that. So I think that was the hardest point for me, was opening up to people that didn't have ADHD. And I felt there was also almost kind of a nervousness of raising it. Oh, I think I might have, because of the comments that you get back. And that kind of does set you back. People would never think of me when I say this, because people think I'm really confident and I'm really strong, I'm really outgoing. But in that moment, it kind of shuts you down and you go back into that place of, well, am I making it up? Um, well, that was the hardest thing, I think, is starting to have those conversations with, and these are people around you, these are like close friends or family members, that just the reactions that I experienced of, well, I've never thought of you like that. Brilliant. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? I never thought of myself like that. So, not everything is outwardly visible. And then, some of the other comments were, well, are you not just really stressed? Are you not just really busy? And I think they were really unhelpful, but what they started to do was to help me explain what was actually going on in my brain. I grew up in a time where ADHD was always the hyperactive naughty boys at school. So there was
Yeah.
no talk of what it looked like in girls and in women. And as I've started to do kind of more reading around that and that understanding, that then helped me kind of explain that I know what you see on the outside, but can I explain what goes on the inside? Can I explain how I think? Can I explain, what those comments do to me? And I think that has changed people's reactions to it. And then you start to have those conversations.
And how it is to, sitting with the realization that, yeah, you might have it before anything is actually named and confirmed. How is that waiting and the process of going through the assessment that we know it's long?
Yeah. I think my experience of going to the doctor was, it was it was quite a funny one, because I think, I could see when she was talking to me, she said, do you want medication? Because we wouldn't put you forward for a diagnosis unless you're wanting to have medication. And I had said, at the moment, I don't know. I don't know enough. But for me, I'm also in perimenopause, which highlights, the ADHD traits further. And I just said, I can't say yes, but I don't want to be in a position where I'm not able to get them when I need them. And you could tell there was points of that conversation. She's a great doctor, but there was points of that conversation where she was like, meh, meh. And I felt like I just went deep and started like unloading all of these stories that probably I hadn't even, thought about their connection, and just offloaded all of these stories. And she just started typing and sent it. She was like, I've put you in for a referral. I think it was kind of to stop me talking at that point. I think what made it really obvious was getting the forms and going through those. And I still felt it was funny, there was quite a bias to the forms when I first got them, but it really made me kind of look back and think about my childhood. And what I think is interesting is trying to look at a childhood where you've gone through life with, that's just how you are, to then trying to look back at it through a different lens. And I think once you start doing that, so much more comes up of, oh, I remember this, or I remember these traits, or I remember struggling with this. So it's quite a lot of processing in the first instance. After I got the forms, sent those off after a period of time of waiting and not doing them properly and filling it wrong because I hadn't read the instructions. Once I'd sent those off, I actually went and saw a therapist, and I wasn't necessarily going to a therapist for, I think I've got ADHD, I need help. I went to it just in general, but I had picked someone that was kind of a specialist. And I think that was really, really powerful in just helping me understand things a little bit. And I kind of, in that moment, sort of realized how much of an impact this first period of just understanding and adjusting. But it was really good to have that support and someone that could connect the dots and say, yeah, that's a trait of ADHD. Yeah, that's why you're doing that. And you're like, okay.
The validation is important
Yeah.
because we've grown up doubting ourselves because we thought that there was something wrong with us. We thought that we just had to try harder. Why can't we try harder? And why can't we be like everybody else? And it's difficult when then you're a grown woman. You've been even successful at that point, and then you have to start going against the flock, right? To say, well, actually, I think I am ADHD, even if nobody else has seen it, even if nobody else has spotted, but you still have that voice that tells you, no, you're wrong. You're exaggerating. Yeah. So having somebody external that says to you, yeah, I see it.
Yeah.
I see what you mean. I think it's extremely powerful. And I relate a lot to your story, about looking at your childhood with a different lens, because then all of a sudden those things that you thought, I struggle because of X, Y, and Z, it all starts to make sense.
Yeah.
And there is this process of grief that comes with it for that support and that kindness that you would have wanted for that child. And it's not possible anymore in a way. So I guess the question that I have for you now is, how were you as a child and growing up?
I was the good girl. So it's one of the things that you read, isn't it? That within younger girls and women, that you're the good girl. I never wanted to do anything wrong. I was well behaved, loved by my teachers, good at my schoolwork. I was very much inside my own head a lot of the time. I thought a lot. I would think things over and over and over before I did anything or I said anything. I was very, very shy for a lot of my childhood and even like my teens and into my 20s. I think it only, if I look at when I started to get to secondary school, so into my teens, that's where I think I noticed a difference. Because I always say I had a certain level of intelligence. I just sailed through school in the early years, always got good grades. I got to a certain point in my teen years, and then I was still good, but I remember that's where I found it harder to focus or concentrate or listen or study. I used to do things like I'd request to be put down a set at school because it was going to be easier for me than having to work really, really hard. I used to take time off school quite a lot. So there was, if I look back now, I can see there was kind of at that tipping point of when things started to change for me. And I think it was that kind of focus thing. And then I always had this belief kind of going through school and then college and then into university that I wasn't very academic and that I wasn't very good at learning. I wasn't very good at retaining information. And actually looking back, it's because the focus isn't there. I can't focus long enough. So I'm hearing a piece of information for, 60 seconds, whereas someone else is hearing about it for 10, 15 minutes. So I've got a small amount of information that I'm trying to take in and keep that inside. And I think I can see that, now I've gone down that journey and I've looked at it, I can see that and I can see how that has impacted my childhood and then some of the decisions that I've made. And then, yeah, just other things I think about kind of the relationships that you form and kind of the positions you take socially. But I was very much, it was never the hyperactive side of things. It was always very much, I was inside my own mind, a million trains of thoughts going on at once, quite negative self-talk, very sensitive to rejection and things like that. And I think that's where you look back and that's where there is a bit of a sadness because it was like, if only you knew, if only, not that I could take it away, but there'd be an understanding there. And so I think some of those times where you look at kind of the harder times or where I was harder on myself, I think that's where some of the sadness comes in.
Yeah. And there is a lot of that. Interestingly, being a woman, you realize that a lot of that, it also coincides with the hormones, right? So
Yeah.
you go into secondary school where you have like this change in hormones and all of a sudden like it's a mess. And then perimenopause and hello, welcome back.
I think
So
that's
it
it. So, there's so many people that I speak to now, around my age that are now starting to question it because, yeah, it comes out so intense. So something that you've just managed for a long time just suddenly presents itself in a much deeper way. And you don't really have the resilience or the reserves that you once had to kind of work with that necessarily. So it is interesting, knowing what I know now and then seeing that happen around me.
And I want to go back briefly about talking about your career. And because you said that you worked, in marketing, which is a very fast paced and high energy
Yeah.
environment. So, how was that career for you? And what made you pivot into your new career?
I loved it. I predominantly worked in advertising or creative agencies for the majority of my career. I just loved it. There was so much variety. I was always working on different accounts and different clients. Um, it was usually a really fun environment to be in. There's quite a lot of the social side to it as well. It kind of felt, I don't know, you kind of felt validated from someone that was quite quiet, quite shy and quite quiet. Coming into that kind of environment, I had to come out of myself a little bit more and I had to be a bit louder, a bit bolder. It was honestly, it was the best. I made some of the best friends I have now I've met from my time in agency. Interestingly, when I'd switched to roles that were in-house in marketing because that's a little bit slower. I used to struggle because I just got bored. It was a slightly slower pace. It was maybe more detailed work rather than focusing on kind of the creative side of things or the exciting side of things. And I loved some of those roles, but I really, really struggled. And so, I always used to go for the smaller companies where you'd be doing a million and one things at once and you'd be known for being brilliant. And I had a reputation of being good at what I did. I never always believed that, but I had a reputation for being good because I could do so many things and I could do them quite quickly and I could take on. And so this level of work and resilience really became part of like my personality and who I was. But that pace also meant that I burnt out a lot. And again, hindsight is a wonderful thing. But looking back, you can see burnout cycles that I had, and I can see how it came about and why. So most of the jobs that I had, I was in marketing for 23 years, and there's a couple that stand out where I stayed longer. But most of the time, if you have a look on my LinkedIn, it goes on for pages. I was there for sort of 12 to 18 months. What I noticed is I used to throw myself into everything at the beginning. It was the best thing. I loved it. I thrived. It was all new and exciting. And I worked really, really hard. And everyone would be like, oh my God, you're amazing. Like, this is so brilliant. And then I would burn myself out. And then I couldn't see a way back from that burnout. I couldn't see a way of operating in the agency because I had set a standard so high that even I couldn't keep up to that. And I didn't quite know how to then communicate, I need to work at a slower pace because slower pace equals you're not doing a good enough job. And so then I'd look to escape and I'd go on to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And there was always something exciting about the new opportunity. And I don't regret any of this. I look back with like fondness because I got to do like incredible things. I've had so many fun experiences, met so many brilliant people. But when you look back through a different lens, you can see the patterns of what was happening. I talked about kind of rejection sensitivity, and that definitely played a part in how I worked because I didn't want to be the best at everything. It wasn't about being the best person in the room, but I had to avoid being told I wasn't very good at my job. So I would do everything I could to prove that I was brilliant at my job. And that just kind of contributed to those burnout cycles. But I did love it. And I think that the pace and the variety is probably why. Again, looking back, you can see that's what I was drawn to and that's what kept me going. And, I might be tired, but I'd do a little bit more because there's something new and something exciting that came in.
And looking back at those burnout cycles, how do they look like now? So, would you be able to recognize them now better? And what did burnout feel for you back then?
I mean, burnout was quite severe for me. And I think each time I hit burnout, it was a little bit harder to get out of it because I think your resilience goes, doesn't it? I definitely know the signs now. I think I have so much self-awareness now that I can, I feel what's changing and notice really small things. And it makes me look at, hang on a minute, something might be out of balance here. Back then, sometimes it would floor me completely. There are times where I've just had to take a few weeks off work. There was times where, I ended up on antidepressants because I don't think burnout was really a thing in my 20s. I don't think anyone talked about burnout. So I'd go in and I'd be feeling like this, that I was exhausted, I'd have panic attacks, and it was burnout. It was always because I'd worked too hard. And not only was I working hard, but I was going out and socializing hard, and I was trying to do absolutely everything. And then I'd burn out. And, there's periods where I'd go to the doctors and, like I said, I'd be signed off and it'd be stress and they'd give me medication. They went on antidepressants once and they just didn't work for me. And then you feel a little bit better and then you go back in. And then before you know it, you're like, oh, there's the exciting new thing again. And then you forget about what's going on. And I think that was one of the dangerous things for me, that you get to a point that you sort of disconnect from what things are. You disconnect from what you're feeling because you're so focused on something else. And I think that is one of the signs for me now when I start to naturally disconnect from, I'm not aware of, I don't feel grounded in what I'm doing. I don't feel grounded about, how I'm spending my time or, what I'm eating and things. When those real basics start to go, that's a sign to me now that something's out of balance and you need to watch this before you go down the path of completely burning yourself out again.
And what made you change your career? And also, like, what influenced your move to Scotland? Because you mentioned, wanting to have like a quieter life, a more like centered life in a way.
So the move to Scotland was fueled by a number of different things. I think, linking to family and our life, and I was getting married, and there were so many things behind it. But I think what really drew me, and I think this was something I noticed in lockdown actually, that I wanted out of the hustle and bustle of being in a city. So I lived in Manchester for 23 years. I lived in South Manchester, a beautiful space, actually quite quiet considering I was so close to the city centre. But everything was so built up. And I noticed that I was craving a different kind of life. So I used to spend a lot of time going outdoor swimming, not necessarily for like the ice hit, although I did quite enjoy that as well. But there was a place I used to drive to in Cheshire and I'd go swimming after work. And as soon as I got in the water and as soon as I was in the countryside, it felt like all the tabs in my brain just started to close and I just felt quiet and I felt still. And this was becoming more and more and more. And it wasn't like, oh, that'd be a really nice thing to have. It was that I needed it. I was so drawn to this. I had cold water tubs at home. I'd get up and go cold water swimming on a morning before work. And some of it was the cold and that feeling, but some of it was about just being out in nature and being in these kind of quieter environments. And I think, was it 2 years before I moved up Scotland? So I was up and down here anyway, part time. There was one summer I made the decision to try and find the things that I liked up here, to try and find a community because I didn't know anyone. And I was like, what are all the things that I love back home, but I don't have up here? And I found that in abundance up here, I've got to say. And I used to go, when I was up here on a Sunday, I'd go and do yoga on the beach and then go for a cold water dip and then we'd sit around afterwards. I just felt so incredible in those moments. And it wasn't just the hit of the cold water. I think it was that shared community of being in these environments and being away from everything. I even remember getting up at 7 o'clock and it was -1 outside and I was in the car in my swim stuff ready to go and do beach yoga, which again, with Scotland, you don't necessarily think about beach yoga, but that's what I did. And, Scotland always had that draw to me because I found so many things all over that were places that I could go and feel a little bit of calm, of stillness, and those things just help my brain kind of switch off. And I think for me, I think I'd spent so many years just living this chaotic lifestyle, the burnout cycles, the busy work, the long hours. I just couldn't do it anymore. There was something inside of me that was screaming at me to kind of stop. And I get these physical, like I just can't do it. And I remember the last agency job that I had before I changed career, I would sit there and I'd spend my days planning out when I could hand my notice in. And in that moment, I think, like I said, I have quite extreme reactions to things, not externally, but inwardly. I'm like, I need to get out of this right now. And I'd sit and I'd plan my exit because I just couldn't be in that business. I'd lost all, you know, the drive that I had before, that excitement that I had. I was like, this is just painful. I was miserable. I was plagued with migraines every week. I was on so much medication for migraines. And I think I knew that's where it stemmed from. And so my decision to pivot was I was looking around the agency one day and I could just see the younger generations coming in and doing the same things and burning out and off with stress and having panic attacks. And I just thought there's got to be a different way. Like, this isn't how it's meant to be. Like, this is a brilliant industry and we get to do so many cool things and we're all miserable in it. And so in that moment, I was like, I want to go away and retrain because I want to come and work with people to change this cycle for them. Like, I can't change my cycle from my 20s, but I can use what I have to work with people in a way that's just a little bit more flexible, not so rigid, not so we should all be hustling and we should all be working to this model, just to understand that we're all humans and just be a little bit kinder to ourselves. And that was kind of the point that, like I said, just looking around and seeing that history is just repeating itself for other people. And that was kind of what kind of triggered that change. And that's been sort of the journey I've gone on since.
What are the best things that you've learned with your new career, and particularly related, to neurodiversity in the workplace?
Best things I've experienced has been, obviously, I'm going to say some of the feedback that I've got. But when I went into this career, I said I wanted to do things differently. Now, not in a way that I'm a disruptor, but I just wanted to treat people as humans and not as this armory of like robots in leadership roles, and we've all got to act in a certain way. And I think some of the feedback that I've had has kind of really appreciated that part of it, of the fact that I don't force people to speak in a session. If you're too shy and you don't want to speak, I'm not forcing you. What good's that going to do? You're going to feel terrible. Having managers that are maybe quieter and more introverted, and just being like, that's cool. Let's look at that as a positive. How do we shape that into something that's positive so you can own who you are? That for me has been like a really lovely part of being part of other people's journeys, is helping them just love the version of them that they are, and just be you, just make that a bit more visible, make that, who you are, and be proud of it, rather than trying to fit into these kind of old-fashioned sort of structures. I think the biggest learning curve I had was working at the university. So I developed there was a character and personal development course that when every student in that university had to study that, and it was credit bearing, and it was like a love-hate relationship, because that's not what they went there to study, but they had to do it to get the degree. And also, as they were coming to the end of uni, they realised how beneficial it was. But going in and talking about some of these things to an audience that hadn't signed up for it, weren't necessarily open to it, and there was a lot of diversity within the students that I met. I think that was the biggest learning curve for me on what diversity actually looked like in reality, and being able to adapt and listen and realize in those sessions, it's not about me. Have I delivered a good session? Because I can only do what I can do, but sharing the information and not looking around the room for, well, did they enjoy it? Have they taken that on board? Are they using it? It just really changed that perspective. And that's really influenced how I work now within workplaces as well, just being a lot more open to the nuances of humans and how they behave and what they need, and opening up the conversations to make everyone feel heard and feel validated, but feel okay with who they are.
That's amazing. And I think it's a recurring theme, the fact that we get our diagnosis late, and with all that grief and sadness, there is something else that emerges, and it's this instinct to help others, to say, we want to turn this into something positive. And I think it's amazing. And that's why I love this podcast, because I get to speak to so many people. I get to know so many stories, and it creates some sort of a community where we're all aligned and we all feel alike. And I think it's just brilliant. and it makes you feel part of something that is bigger.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think there's so much content out there now about neurodiversity and people's experiences. And I think sometimes it gets a bad rep that people are making light of it or they're cutting it down because it's on TikTok or Instagram or something. But I think I agree with you that there's so much power because my story could help someone recognize something in themselves and think, actually, is that what ADHD is? Or they might recognize something that they also have and it stops them holding that shame around, the diagnosis, especially when it's later in life. And because there's so much negative press about everyone's got ADHD or we're overdiagnosed, all of that things. And I think you're right. It's this community of just shared stories and shared experiences. And it gives you that validation in a way, but it also um, it just makes you feel less alone. And I think, I go back to those few years where I was trying to figure it out and I was trying to have these conversations. I didn't know who to go to and have that serious conversation. But had I had that, that would have been really, really helpful for me.
And, having had this very interesting career in a fast paced environment and now what you're experiencing, where do you think that the workplaces really need to change in mindset or in practice to move from performative inclusion to actually genuine support?
Yeah. I think a lot of the performative stuff, I think there's good intention there, but I think people don't have the time or the budgets to think about and do things properly. I think there's got to be the understanding that neurodiversity is different for everyone. You don't just have an ADHD person and you give them a set of headphones and something else and then, they're off and they're fine. It's so different for everyone and it's also different, all the contributing factors that come into it. So, I managed a career for 20 something years. So me finding out was like, well, I've already got ways of coping. I maybe don't need as much as someone that's, has found out in their early 20s and hasn't got used to the workplaces as well. So I think it's just understanding that everything is completely different and it doesn't always, I hate the term like adjustments as well, because they are adjustments, but I don't know, it makes you feel like I've got to ask for like special things when actually a lot of the adjustments we talk about are just things that everyone would benefit from, even like, neurotypical people. I think, if we go back to pre-COVID and the working world was 9 to 5 or 9 to 6, or in my case, it was like 9 to 7 or 8, and I'd have to be in the office every day and I was exhausted. And I look back and I don't know how I did that. Genuinely, I did it a couple of weeks ago. I was back in Manchester and I got the bus to where I used to go to work. I was like, I just don't know how I did this 5 days a week. It's like, it was exhausting, just that commute. So I think there are some positives in how things have changed from that hybrid point of view. I think how we change this, I know there's a lot of training out there, and I think the training is valid and that it gives some awareness. But what happens after that 1 day course? Because a 1 day course isn't going to make someone aware of what it's like or what the people may need. I know people that have been on courses like this and, there's behaviors going on in workplaces that is close to bullying because they're just asking for something that person, like with the best will in the world, they cannot do. The brain just doesn't work like that, and just putting more and more pressure on that person isn't going to help things. And so I think this kind of, inclusion needs to come from the core of the business. There needs to be a genuine want to make the workplace inclusive, and that has to flow through everything, like the processes, the structures, your policies. Everything needs to be looked at with the lens of this inclusive, and not just for, neurodiversity, but for everything. And to do that, working within businesses, I know that to do that is such a huge job that there's maybe not the people, the time, the budget, because it's quite a huge undertaking. But I do think that's where it needs to come from.
It's interesting because while you were talking, I was thinking about something that I've recently done at my workplace because I have a 9 to 5 job and then I opened my coaching business as a side business exactly because I wanted to help other people. I wanted to turn this into something positive. But in my 9 to 5, very corporate job, I'm also an IBD ambassador for accessibility. And one of the things that we've done recently was developing these training for managers around neurodiversity. And one of the first questions while we were developing the training was, what happens after? Because it's all good, like we can put all the resources in there, but what happens after? And that is the question that I've asked to the provider, which is Parul Singh, that I think she's amazing. She's brilliant. And she really helped us because she helped us shaping this into, what if we give the people that undergo this training the opportunity to then have like a group discussion in the end? Because it's like, it's a lived experience then. It's not just the training and what you learned at that point. It becomes, again, a community, becomes culture, because we can discuss it and we can say, oh, how did you apply this? Or, I found this very interesting. And when I applied, this is what happened. And all of a sudden, it doesn't remain that training that sits somewhere in your shared folder or in a policy. It's something that becomes alive and it becomes part of the culture of the business. And I think it's something that people should start considering. As you said, it's not that one-off thing. It's more than that. It's going beyond. And I also like the idea of, most of the things that you might ask for might benefit everyone. And it's
I know we're made to feel like these special adjustments. And I think it's just that we're human beings and we're not the same every day. And we don't, we're not robots. Yet the way work is sometimes structured is that kind of regardless of what's going on, you've got to turn up. I'm very much, because of the kind of work I've done, I need to change my environment based on, the type of work I'm doing. Some of it I need to be sat at a desk. Some of it I need to be, if I'm writing copy, I'll be laid on a sofa because I need to be comfortable. Going into these offices where there's big open plan offices and loads of noise and there's all of these things that you just can't get your work done. So a lot of it is around giving people the right environment to be able to work rather than them having to battle against the environment and then work on top of that. It's really, really draining. And I think there's lots of changes that are quite simple that can be made. And I want to agree with you, Parul Singh is incredible. I've learned so much from the content that she shares around this. And I know she does a lot of work with this. And I think it is around that community or that conversation. So many people, like I do a lot of management training now, and not just from a neurodiversity point of view, but a lot of managers are saying, well, I don't know how to have that conversation. And that might be someone's mental health or, something happened and they don't feel confident having that conversation. So therefore they don't have that conversation. And I think it's the same with kind of neurodiversity. How do you have that conversation? How do you, when someone discloses they've got a diagnosis, how do you just have a normal conversation with them, not pulling out forms and asking questions and tick boxing? How do you just have that conversation with them as a human? And I think if we had more of that community, more of that space, more of that kind of open dialogue, that would make things better moving forward for sure.
Also the confidence to challenge the status quo, right? Because I've seen a lot, particularly recently, of we should go back to the office because all the companies are doing that. And you're like, yeah, but you're not all the companies. You need to look at what your company is doing. You need to look at what your workforce is comprised of. You need to really look into how you function. It's not a trend that the business risk assessment needs to be done on your people and your actual business. I was looking, like I'm working in operations now. So I was looking at one of the meetings that we had, and this meeting is in person only. And I was like, why? Because it promotes collaboration. Why? Oh, because and I kept going down and down to the point that I said, I think you just want the control over the situation. And if you arrive at that point that you need to have people in the room in order to exert that control, it means that the systems that you have before that have already failed. So it's literally shifting the perspective that it's not about, I hate the word, reasonable adjustments, because it's not that. It's understanding who you have in front of you and how they can work at their best and be a contributor. And basically, you put them in the position to do the job that you hired them for.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It's how do you get the best out of people? How do you get the best work? And like I said, I know I need to be in different environments for the different kind of work that I do. Some days I can't sit at a desk because it doesn't feel comfortable for me to be creative, for example. So sometimes it's being out on a walk and, all these things. And I think there's so much of a hangover that you've got a leadership of a certain age that has grown up in a structure where this is what good looked like, and they're desperately trying to pull us back to what good looked like. And I get that, and I think this is naturally going to change, as the younger generations are coming through into leadership roles, and there is more understanding of inclusion. But I experienced the very same thing as you. It's got to be in person. Okay, so you're going to have a 2-hour meeting in person. Have you considered that 2 hours is too long? Have you considered that, you need to have breaks? Have you considered that people won't be able to take the information in? And they're not, again, we don't start with the person, we start with what we want to do. So it's going to be a 2-hour meeting. We're going to give you all this deep information. And at the end, we're going to say, well, no one engaged. Of course they didn't engage because 2 hours is too long. Their minds have wandered. I think you can get me for half an hour max. And that's on a good day before I'm off and I start wandering. So for the rest of that time, I'm thinking about other things. I'm doing stuff. I'll be on my phone or I'll be doing work. And so no, I haven't taken in the information that you want. So that was a complete waste of time because it's your poor planning and your poor understanding of how to get the information across. And I think this always links back into when I was working in marketing and branding, because we always had to start with the consumer. What do we want the consumer to do? What do we want them to hear? What do we want them to take away? We didn't just tell them what we wanted. I mean, there were companies that did and they weren't as good. But you always started with that person. What do we want them to do? How do we get the best out of them? How do we get them to go and buy the product that we want? So we have to hit them with what's interesting to them. And I don't know whether having that background and that understanding from a marketing and branding point of view, because it did start with the customer, does help me do what I do now. Because again, I start with the person first. So who have we got in front of us? What do we want them to understand? What do we want them to take away? And how do we communicate that? And that might be why I think in that way. I don't know, but there's just such a lack of understanding of people, and it comes back to these really old-fashioned structures. And I agree. I think people would force in person so much that they would rather have worse results. And I think it comes from control, from trust, from everyone, we're not being respected as a company or a leadership. And then, you go back to, well, but Google are a massive company. They have different structures, different people. They've got a brilliant on-site cafe that, people can get all of that. There's just all of these things that it isn't a like for like comparison. And just because they're doing it, it doesn't mean that works for them. And it also doesn't mean that that's what everyone's doing it. That's what the press is telling you. That's what their press release is saying. It's not the reality of what goes on within the business.
Yeah. And I want to go back for a second on your personal experience. And looking back, like even when you were in your 20s, and growing up until the point that you are now, which traits do you recognize the most in yourself now?
The speed at which my brain works is probably the biggest one. It took a while for me to understand. And I used to say, I can do like a week's worth of work in 2 days. But I just thought that was like everyone could do that. I thought I'm really special. I don't know. But that's one of the biggest traits that I think stands out for me. So like I love and I thrive off, you know, um, in business structures, in strategies, in solutions, fixing problems. There's something about if I can see it and understand it, it's just really obvious to me what we need to do and I can work through it quite quickly. And I think that's one of the traits that I think went unnoticed for so long, or I didn't realize that that was a strength of mine. So I probably didn't play into that as much as I maybe do now.
And is there any trait that you've struggled with in your life and you think even now, like you're still struggling with?
I think probably that motivation / need of pressure to get things done. So if I have no structure at all, if I have no deadlines at all, I will just float about and things will not get done. And that frustrates me. So I need that that pressure to get things started, or that deadline to make sure I've got to work towards something. I need that kind of structure, even though I rebel against structure. But I know that I work better in that way. It's balancing that, because that structure or that pressure also can lead to overwhelm and then lead to burnout as well. And I think that's the one that I still struggle with today, getting that the right balance of it.
And how about impulsivity? Because we've talked a lot about, how the brain goes faster. And that is one of the things that I struggle with the most, for example.
Yeah. I mean, if I told you that I went on holiday to Bali, went to an island, found a shop I loved and imported probably £1,500 worth of reworked vintage clothes because I decided I was going to sell them, that's the level of impulsivity I've got.
I love this.
I think that's, when I speak to people, they laugh because I've tried different businesses, I've tried different things, and, I very much know that I find something and then that becomes my whole personality. And I will put money into it and I'll throw myself into it. And then as fast as I've done that, I'm like, no, I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. And one of the first people I spoke to who also has ADHD, she laughed. She went, "Of course you have. That's why you've started all these businesses over the years." So there's definitely an impulsivity, and it's something that I've really become aware of. And that can be, starting a business and thinking that's going to be my whole new thing, to needing to buy a particular coat, for example, like, oh my God, this coat is going to change my life. And then by the time it turns up, I'm like, oh, I'm not even that bothered about it. And, I've really noticed this in kind of spending habits and stuff as well. Just putting so much into, this coat I laugh about, but I decided I loved it, but I didn't know if I wanted it. And then it was out of stock, so I had to have it. So I spent like hours searching for it, found it, bought it. And then it got lost. But by the time it got lost, I was like, I'm not really that bothered. But all that time and energy and effort, because this thing was honestly, it felt like it was going to change my life. So yeah, there's definite impulsivity. I'm aware of it more now, shall we say. I try and talk to myself around some of it and make sure, because in some ways I think it's a really good thing. I think, I wouldn't have done half the things that I've done if it wasn't there. And I think it's kind of a brilliant trait to have. I think it's just, being aware of it and keeping it in balance, keep it in check a little bit.
Yeah. It's like, let it not become a tax on your life.
Yeah.
And that is the challenge, because I like when you said, "Oh, this really is going to change my life." Like every time that I have a new idea, a new project, despite the fact that I'm very technology oriented, I still need to have a new notebook. Like it doesn't matter what it is. Like I need to have another notebook. And it needs to be specific for that project. Like there is something else that I started and I just bought myself like this notebook that is all with Van Gogh paintings. And I'm like, but you don't use it because then you translate everything into your like electronic notes. Doesn't matter. So you go with the flow sometimes.
I spent £100 a new planner notebook combined with all the accessories that I imported from Australia at Christmas. And it's brilliant, but I don't need it and I don't use it. A standard notebook's fine, but I felt like this was going to be everything. Yeah, it's being used, but not to its full advantage.
It helps with the dopamine. Let's leave it at that.
Yes, it absolutely does.
I'm going to ask you one last question, and it's about, the journey that you're having, because your diagnosis is not fully there yet. So for those that are listening that are either going through the process and are in the waiting phase, or they're willing to start, what piece of advice would you give them? What would you want to say to them?
To be kind to yourself. It's I spoke to a friend about this recently. She's at the very start of wondering if she may have ADHD. And we had the conversation. I said, have you found it? Are you at the point where you find it funny yet? And she went, no, not at all. And there is that part that I think it's confusing at first. Like I said, you feel like you've got judgment from everyone. You've got the grief stages that you go through, that kind of but what if I'd known what would be different? And then you doubt yourself. But I have got to a point now where I can laugh about things. Like, we're laughing about the impulsivity and the coat that's going to change my life. And I think it's having a kindness with yourself that it's not the easiest thing to come to, especially when it's later diagnosed, because you've got this whole lifetime of things. But within that lifetime, you've found your ways of coping. And like, to get to this point and survive to this point, I think is like incredible. So to be kind to yourself about that, but to also not try and shut down some of the traits. I think I speak to a lot of people, like, I spoke to someone like last week actually, and at the start of their career, and very much feels like they've got their diagnosis, but they're trying to shut down who they are and their traits. And it's like, let's not do that. We're not trying to remove all the traits. Like, we're not trying to remove the impulsivity, just trying to manage it a little bit better. So it's, we're not causing ourselves that chaos or that calm. But I think embracing who you are and embracing the traits and working to them. So, I know my brain works really fast. I can get loads of work done. So do your work and then have the rest of the week off. I can say that because I work for myself. Understand your traits and work with them and be kind to yourself. And if you can, find that support, find that community, whether that's, a podcast like this, whether it's, someone that produces content that you really relate with, but find that support or that community as well that just helps support you on that journey.
Thank you so much, Beccy. It's been like amazing talking to you. I really loved every second of it. Thank you.
Thank you. I think this felt like a therapy session.
I love that.
It's nice though, because I'm still really early on. Like I said, I haven't actually, who knows when I'll get a date for a diagnosis, but you sometimes don't just sit and have the opportunity to reflect back and to think about things and to talk about things. So it's been, it's been a really lovely thing to do. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. The Spacious Brain Podcast will come back soon with a new episode and new stories to share. So stay tuned and follow me now, before you forget.